My name is Ava Holloway. I'm 34 years old, and at 6:12 on a Thursday evening, while standing in a hospital service corridor, still wearing my badge and a blazer that smelled faintly of stale coffee and antiseptic, I listened to a voicemail that should have broken me. Instead, it clarified everything. My mother's voice was cold, polished, and controlled, the same voice she used whenever she wanted to sound righteous in front of strangers. "You're cut off. Don't contact us again. We're moving forward without you." Then she hung up, as if she were delivering a verdict rather than abandoning her own daughter. I stood there staring at the cinder block wall while a janitor pushed a cart past me and a code alarm echoed somewhere down the hall. I didn't cry. I didn't call back. I replayed the message once, then twice, because I needed to hear the contempt clearly enough to stop lying to myself about what my family had become. They hadn't simply pushed me out. They had finally spoken aloud what they had been practicing for years. I was useful only when I solved their emergencies, signed their forms, cleaned up their messes, and helped their lives appear respectable from the outside. The moment I stopped being convenient, I became disposable, so I texted one word in response. Okay. By 8 o'clock the next morning, access was locked. A house deal had collapsed, and the first crack in their perfect little future had already split wide open. Before I tell you what she said next, and why their lawyer eventually ended up begging me to answer the phone, tell me what time it is, where you are, and where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels before it reaches someone who has lived through something similar. Here's what my mother didn't understand when she sent that message. She believed she was cutting off the family disappointment. What she actually removed was the one person who knew exactly where every fragile support beam was hidden inside the house they were pretending would never collapse. I wasn't an ATM with feelings. I was the person who had spent 6 years quietly untangling every financial emergency they created and then disguised as temporary bad luck. My background wasn't in banking or real estate. I worked in forensic compliance for hospital foundations and private care networks, which meant I was very skilled at identifying where money was supposed to go, where it actually ended up, and what happens when people assume a signature from a trusted relative can erase a questionable trail. My family never respected that work, but they absolutely valued what it could do for them. Over time, I became the person who reviewed contracts they never bothered to read, corrected tax exposures they didn't understand, structured payment plans they couldn't realistically maintain, and translated consequences into language they could conveniently ignore. The most recent problem involved a luxury downsizing move my parents had been boasting about for months. They planned to sell the old family property, move bridge funds through a temporary escrow arrangement, and close on a high-end gated townhouse near the lake. To their friends, they described it as a fresh new chapter. What they weren't saying was that the bridge arrangement only existed because I had agreed, against my better judgment, to oversee the legal access chain, verify the source of funds documentation, and maintain shared authorization over 2 linked accounts until closing. Not ownership, not theft. Nothing dramatic or illegal like the exaggerated stories you see online. Just the very real kind of administrative trust people exploit when they assume you will never stop rescuing them. At 7:43 the following morning, I sat at my kitchen island with my laptop open, my coffee untouched, and my mother's voicemail repeating in my mind like a metronome. Then I did exactly what a competent professional does when a hostile party explicitly severs contact while still depending on her legal cooperation. I withdrew my participation. I notified the title coordinator that I would no longer serve as the verification contact for the source documentation package. I informed the broker in writing that I revoked my authorization to communicate on the transaction. I flagged the shared access credentials for immediate suspension pending identity revalidation. I also sent a short, entirely professional note to the family accountant stating that any document previously routed through me would need to be reissued without my credentials, my review chain, or my indemnification language attached. No shouting, no threats, no revenge speech, just a series of lawful withdrawals from systems that functioned only because I was part of them. And then the consequences began arriving faster than I expected. The townhouse closing was delayed within an hour because the seller's side refused to proceed with incomplete verification on a time-sensitive transfer. A restoration contractor my father had already hired for the old property paused their move-out schedule because the deposit confirmation didn't clear in the expected format. And a private care facility my mother had been courting for my grandmother's temporary transition requested updated payment assurances before reserving the suite she had been proudly mentioning to her friends. That last detail made me pause. It was the first sign that this situation wasn't just about another upscale relocation fantasy. They were moving my grandmother too, and they had been doing it with a level of financial confidence that only made sense if they believed I would cushion every landing. By noon, the first call came through. I let it ring, then another, then 6 more. Funny how quickly "don't contact us again" turns into "why aren't you answering" when the paperwork stops moving. Have you ever noticed that some families only believe in boundaries when they are the ones setting them? I didn't hear my mother's voice first. I heard panic disguised as my father's voice like a poorly fitted suit. He left 2 voicemails before lunch, trying to sound composed and failing both times. "There's been a misunderstanding." 20 minutes later, another message followed. "You need to call us today." By 3 p.m., the tone had shifted from strained dignity to clear alarm. "The title company says there's a hold. Patricia says you pulled authorizations. I don't know what game you're playing, but this has to be fixed before the end of the day." I saved the messages and went back to work. I was reviewing an audit trail for a donor-funded oncology wing when my phone lit up again and again on the desk beside me, each vibration more frantic than the last. I remember glancing down at the screen and seeing the family group chat suddenly active after weeks of silence, as if my existence had only been restored because their timeline was collapsing. That evening, I finally opened the messages. My sister didn't ask what had happened. She accused me. "How could you do this right before the move? Mom is humiliated. Do you even understand the damage?" There it was, the familiar family logic. Their choices, my fault. Their lies, my burden. Their embarrassment, my emergency. I almost responded, but then a voicemail transcription from my mother appeared, and I read it twice because the hypocrisy was so perfect it felt at her word. The moment that truly changed everything came later that night when I reviewed an email thread I had almost ignored. It was from the care liaison at the private residence my mother had been using to relocate my grandmother. They weren't asking me to pay anything. They were asking me to confirm whether the funding structure the family had previously described was still valid. The reason was simple. The deposit had been presented as tied to proceeds from the townhouse purchase, which in turn depended on the sale of the old property. And now that entire process appeared to be stalled. The liaison remained careful and professional, but the implication was clear. My mother had been shopping for a prestige care facility she couldn't actually secure without stacking one unstable promise on top of another. She had built the entire chain on my reliability, then cut me off as if I were the problem. 2 days after the voicemail, I had 58 missed calls. Not 79, not some exaggerated number for dramatic effect. 58, and every one of them mattered, because each call marked how quickly control was slipping away from people who had spent years treating me like a backup generator they could kick whenever the lights went out. The calls came from my parents, my sister, 2 unknown numbers, a broker, and a contractor. Then at 8:17 p.m., I received the message that made it clear there was more at stake than a delayed closing. It came from a law office. "Miss Holloway, this is Graham Pike representing your parents. We have a serious problem and need to speak tonight." I stared at the screen, then at the old voicemail from my mother, and then back again. Serious problem. Those words sound very different when they come from someone who bills by the hour. I typed back exactly 6 words. "Enjoy moving forward." You said that first. Then I placed my phone face down and allowed them to sit in the silence they had tried to give me. What would you do when the same people who cast you out suddenly need your name attached to their survival? The next morning, I learned what the serious problem actually was. And it wasn't just a house. It involved reputation, leverage, and the kind of paper trail people assume no one inside the family will ever reveal. Graham Pike called again from a different number, and this time I answered. Lawyers rarely become theatrical unless something expensive is on fire. He started carefully, almost too calmly. He said there had been unexpected complications tied to the property sequence, the assisted living reservation, and certain statements made to third parties about available liquidity. I asked him to speak plainly. There was a pause. Then he did. My parents had already presented themselves to the seller, the care facility, and at least one social board as fully funded for a major lifestyle transition. My mother, who served on the fundraising committee for a boutique elder care charity, had apparently leveraged that image everywhere. She had promised a sponsorship package, hinted at hosting an event in the new townhouse, and told people the family was consolidating assets smoothly. Except the liquidity wasn't smooth. It was fragile. My father had been carrying business debt I didn't even know existed. My sister had quietly maxed out a joint emergency credit line that was supposed to remain untouched. And the old property required repairs serious enough to scare off a price-sensitive buyer if they were disclosed too late. They weren't moving from strength. They were scrambling before anyone noticed. I asked Graham the only question that mattered. Did anyone forge my review or imply I was still overseeing this after I withdrew? His silence told me more than his answer did. He finally said that some parties may have relied on prior understandings involving my role. That's lawyer language for someone becoming comfortable using my credibility after they no longer had my consent. My chest went cold then, not with anger, but with certainty. I told him I would communicate only in writing. He began pushing, mentioning family stress, my grandmother's transition, my mother's blood pressure, and the sensitivity of the situation. I cut him off. A serious problem for them does not create an obligation for me. Then I hung up. The rest unraveled piece by piece. A member of the charity board forwarded me, accidentally or perhaps intentionally, a draft invitation for a donor evening hosted by my mother in the townhouse that hadn't even been purchased yet. The event description praised the Holloway family's continued commitment to dignified elder support. Under any circumstances, it would have sounded insincere. Knowing that my grandmother was being moved around like a decorative element in a branding campaign funded by unsecured money made it worse. I also discovered that my sister had been telling multiple people that I was handling the compliance side of the transition. It was a phrase vague enough to sound impressive and false enough to expose me if anything collapsed. That was when the situation stopped being about hurt feelings and became about self-preservation. If their fantasy collapsed publicly while my name floated in the background, I wouldn't just be the daughter they had used. I would be the professional whose credibility was dragged into their vanity project. So I gathered everything: the voicemail where my mother cut me off, the timestamps of my revoked permissions, the email confirming my withdrawal from all authorizations, the care facility's request for updated assurances, the event draft, and the messages from my sister. I compiled them into a clean folder, the way I would assemble any case file, not to destroy them recklessly, but to ensure the truth had structure if I ever needed it. That afternoon, my mother finally stopped pretending to be offended and showed me exactly who she was. She called from a blocked number. When I answered, she didn't say hello. She said, "How dare you embarrass us like this? Not how dare you abandon the family? Not why are you doing this? Embarrass us." That was the center of her universe. I told her the embarrassment came from building a public life on promises she couldn't afford to keep. She snapped back that everything they had done was for the family, that I was selfish, cold, and impossible to love lately. Then she made the mistake that erased the last of my hesitation. She said, after everything we sacrificed, you owed us cooperation. Owed. There it was. Not love. Not trust. Debt. The same debt they had been collecting since I was 21, and the first person in the family who understood contracts, deadlines, and consequences. You want the villains to be clearer? This was the moment, because the truth is, their cruelty didn't start with one voicemail. It began years earlier, when my father borrowed from my graduate fund to save face on a failed investment, and I was told not to be dramatic. It deepened when my mother pressured me to skip a fellowship interview so I could help stage a charity luncheon she wanted photographed for the local press. Exactly the way people least expect trouble to arrive. Calm, early, and dressed like someone who belongs in rooms where appearances are expected to hold steady. The conservatory was full of glass, winter greenery, polished wood, and wealthy guests performing empathy over glasses of champagne. I saw my mother across the room immediately, smiling with that charitable softness she only used when there were witnesses. My father stood near the donor wall looking 20 years older than he had a week earlier. My sister was laughing too loudly beside a trustee I recognized from a regional health board. Then my mother saw me. For one brief second, her face forgot how to perform. She crossed the room quickly, teeth tight behind a smile. "Why are you here?" she asked, barely moving her lips. "I was invited into the story you've been telling," I replied. She tried to guide me toward a side corridor, but two women turned at the tension in her voice, so she kept smiling. "This is not the place," she said softly. "You made it the place when you used my name to hold your version together," I answered just as quietly. That unsettled her. She hissed that everyone already knew I had been difficult, unstable, and vindictive since pulling support during a family crisis. I asked whether by support she meant my credibility, my labor, or the authorization she continued using after cutting me off. That landed harder than I expected because my father, standing only a few feet away, looked directly at the floor. My sister rushed in next, tense with panic and strong perfume. "Can you not do this here?" she muttered. "Mom is barely holding it together." I looked at her and remembered every time she had used tears to outsource the consequences of her decisions. "Interesting," I said. "Because I remember all of you being very committed to moving forward without me." She grabbed my arm. That was her mistake. Not because it hurt, but because people noticed. A trustee turned, then a donor couple, then one of the event coordinators, who already looked exhausted and suspicious. My mother immediately adjusted her strategy and raised her voice slightly, just enough to sound wounded, not enough to sound responsible. "Ava, please. This is about your grandmother." That line was meant to make me look cruel if I didn't give in. Instead, I said the quietest thing in the room. "Then let's talk about Grandma." Silence behaves differently in wealthy rooms. It doesn't crash, it freezes. I asked my mother whether the care residents had been told the deposit relied on a closing that had not yet happened. I asked my father whether the seller knew the old property repairs were more extensive than originally represented. I asked my sister whether she had told people I was still handling compliance after I had revoked that role in writing. No shouting, no theatrics, just questions sharp enough to puncture the image they had built around themselves. My mother tried to stop me by calling me cruel. My father insisted this was private. My sister began crying on cue, but by then the wrong people were listening. One trustee stepped closer and asked gently but clearly, "Was Miss S. Holloway not involved in the transition after all?" I turned to him and said, "Not after I was told not to contact them again. I have the voicemail, the withdrawal notices, and the timestamps if anyone needs clarification." My mother went pale, not angry pale, but cornered pale. She knew exactly what mattered in that room. Not morality, not family loyalty, documented inconsistency. Within minutes, the board chair pulled her aside. The event coordinator whispered to someone from legal. My father looked like he might be sick. My sister kept insisting it was all a misunderstanding, but her mascara was running and no one important was comforting her. That still wasn't the hardest moment. The hardest moment came from a woman I had met only twice before, an older donor with the kind of wealth that never needs to raise its voice. She looked at my mother and said evenly, "Patricia, were charitable commitments discussed before your own household obligations were stable?" It was such a precise question that it divided the room instantly because everyone there understood what it meant. Had she been performing generosity with money she didn't control while her private obligations were being held together by a daughter she had just publicly criticized? My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. I left before the spectacle could turn into something cheap. But I didn't leave empty-handed. As I walked out, Graham Pike intercepted me near the coat check without any trace of his earlier composure. He asked if we could please resolve matters quietly. Quietly, another favorite word people use when they really mean before the consequences become permanent. I told him I had no interest in spectacle, only distance and accuracy. He said my parents were now facing the collapse of the property sale, scrutiny from the charity board, and a possible complaint over misrepresentations tied to a care contract. I looked at him and said, "That sounds serious." Then I took my coat and went home. Let me ask you something. When a family uses your silence as material for their lies, is speaking up revenge or simply self-defense? Public embarrassment didn't fix me. It didn't send me celebrating around my apartment, healed and triumphant, the way simple revenge stories pretend. It left me restless, nauseated, and unable to sleep. I kept replaying the conservatory scene, not because I regretted telling the truth, but because people like my family train you to feel guilty the moment you stop absorbing the impact for them. All weekend, my phone buzzed with shifting tactics. My father sent a text saying my mother's blood pressure had spiked and that whatever this was had gone too far. My sister wrote 3 paragraphs about trauma, loyalty, and how I was punishing everyone over a communication issue. My mother alternated between silence and short, venomous messages, implying I had destroyed my grandmother's future out of spite. Not one of them acknowledged the actual sequence of events. She cut me off. They continued relying on my role. I withdrew properly, and their false structure collapsed under its own weight. I didn't go to therapy with a wise boyfriend summarizing the lesson in a single sentence. I went because my hands were shaking when I opened my inbox, and because I realized something uncomfortable. Even after all this, some part of me still wanted permission to stop rescuing them. I met with a trauma therapist named Dr. Elise Mercer, and she did not flatter me with cliches about empowerment. She asked me one question that stayed with me. When did your family first teach you that usefulness was the price of belonging? I sat there for a long time before answering. I was 13 when my mother began asking me to mediate arguments between her and my father because I was the calm one. 16 when I started reading loan paperwork out loud because the adults in my house preferred optimism to details. 21 when I was told delaying my plans for 1 year to stabilize the family was noble. 28 when I realized there would never be a final emergency, just a rotating series of crises tied together by entitlement. Dr. Mercer didn't tell me to forgive. She told me to document my reality so I wouldn't allow other people to narrate me out of it. So I did. I wrote down the incidents I had minimized for years, the graduate fund quietly siphoned away, the fellowship opportunities sabotaged, the temporary caregiving responsibilities that turned into unpaid project management for every crisis my parents created. The way my sister learned that tears could redirect money and labor toward her faster than honesty ever could. Once it was written down, the pattern stopped looking like family chaos and started looking like systematic extraction. Then came the confrontation at the old house. My father asked to meet. He said he wanted one adult conversation without shouting. Against my better judgment, I went. But emotionally, I didn't go alone. I brought dates, screenshots, and a mind finally anchored to facts. The house looked half-packed and hollow, designer chairs wrapped in moving blankets, artwork missing from the walls, cracks in the entry trim that she was asked to step back from the charity's Elder Support Committee pending clarification of recent concerns, which, in polished social language, usually means the room no longer trusts you near its money or its reputation. My sister's already fragile lifestyle fractured next. The joint emergency credit line she had drained became impossible to hide once no one else was quietly covering the gaps for her. The boyfriend she had been impressing with carefully curated luxury apparently had strong views about honesty. Once collection notices began arriving, my father, who had spent years floating above consequences with tired dignity, ended up taking consulting work he once dismissed just to keep the debt from escalating. And my grandmother, that was the one area I refused to let them weaponize. I did not rush in and rescue the entire family. I did something far more controlled through a separate documented channel, and only after confirming that doing so would not pull me back into their financial chaos. I helped secure a modest and reputable placement for her through a social worker contact unconnected to my parents' vanity plans. No luxury brochure, no donor dinner narrative, just safe care, honest numbers, and professionals who understood that dignity does not require marble countertops and ribbon-cutting speeches. When my mother found out, she called shouting that I had humiliated her by downgrading Grandma's future. That word told me everything. To her, care had always been image first, human needs second. What changed in me wasn't that I became hard. It was that I became unavailable for distortion. I stopped reading every message. I routed all legal or financial communication into a dedicated folder and responded only when necessary, and only in writing, with no emotional openings. I also told extended relatives a brief version of the truth before my mother could complete the story in which I was unstable. Some believed me immediately because, as it turned out, people had noticed more than I realized. Others did not. That was fine. One of the unexpected freedoms of stepping out of a family role is realizing that you do not need to win every audience. You only need to stop volunteering as the stage. About a month later, Graham Pike contacted me again, not to threaten and not to negotiate a restoration, but to ask whether I would sign a statement clarifying the timeline of my withdrawal from all family-related transactions. Not for my parents' benefit, for containment. The board, the care facility, and one lender all wanted the sequence documented. I signed a precise statement that did one thing only. It separated my name from their conduct. No embellishment, no revenge speech, just a clean record. That was more damaging than any confrontation could have been. Because once the facts were fixed, they could no longer portray me as the cause of damage they had created themselves. Then came the final meeting, the one that might have turned this into a soft reconciliation story if I had been a different person. My mother asked to see me in person, not at a cafe with sunlight and quiet music, but at her attorney's office, because by then even she understood that everything important between us required witnesses. I almost declined, but I wanted to hear, just once, whether she could say a true thing without wrapping it in self-pity. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not humbled in the inspiring way people like to romanticize. Smaller in the practical way, consequences shrink people who believe they were exempt. She did not begin with an apology. She began with hardship, how stressed they had been, how embarrassed, how much had been lost. I let her speak until she ran out of rearranged explanations and had no choice but to face the obvious. Then I said, "You told me not to contact you again." I respected that. "You kept using what I built after pushing me out. That is why everything collapsed." She tried crying then. Real tears, perhaps, but tears are not truth. They are only weather. My father stared at the table. My sister was not there. Apparently, even she understood the performance would not hold. Finally, my mother asked the question she should have asked years earlier, though not for noble reasons. "Is there anything we can do to fix this?" And there it was. The sentence every toxic family hopes will still be available after they have burned through every other bridge. The moment where the useful daughter offers a